A round tin of saltine crackers sat on the same kitchen counter in Scranton, Pennsylvania for 9 years. It belonged to a widow named Doris Novak. She filled it every 2 weeks, same brand, same store. That tin is connected to number 21 on this list. Number 14 costs less than a dime to make. Number 9 was the only snack a retired schoolteacher in Ohio could eat after she lost most of her teeth. These 25 snacks were built for speed and survival. They fed seniors eating alone in kitchens that used to be full. People stretching a Social Security check across 30 days and needing something between meals that were already too small. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten poor man 5-minute snacks for seniors living alone. Number 25, saltine crackers and milk. This was the snack that said you had almost nothing left, and you were still going to eat something tonight. A handful of saltines crumbled into a bowl, cold milk poured over the top. Some people added a spoonful of sugar. Some added a pinch of cinnamon. Most added nothing at all. In the 1930s, families across the Midwest fed their children this before bed because it was the cheapest thing in the house that still felt like a meal. A box of saltines cost 19 cents in 1940. Milk was 13 cents a quart. For a senior living alone in the 1970s or 1980s, this was not breakfast and not dinner. It was the thing you ate at 9 o'clock at night when the hunger came back and you did not have the energy to stand at the stove again. You sat at the table with that bowl, and the sound of the crackers softening in the milk was the only sound in the house. It was simple. It was enough. And it asked nothing of you except a bowl and a spoon. Number 24, cinnamon toast. A slice of bread, a pat of butter, a shake of cinnamon, a sprinkle of sugar. Under the broiler for 2 minutes until the sugar bubbled and the edges turned golden brown. That was it. Mothers made this for children after school in every decade from the 1920s through the 1980s. But the people who kept making it longest were the ones who lived alone. A retired postal worker in Indianapolis made cinnamon toast every evening at 6:30 for 11 years after his wife passed. He used the same butter dish she had picked out at a department store in 1962. The toast took 2 minutes. The ritual took a lifetime. A loaf of bread cost 36 cents in 1975. Sugar was a pantry staple that never ran out. For a senior with arthritis, this was one of the few snacks that could be made entirely with one hand. You did not even need a knife if you used soft butter. Warm, sweet, and familiar. Like something you remembered before you could remember anything at all. Number 23, bread and butter with sugar. Before cinnamon toast had a name, there was this: a slice of white bread spread thick with butter and covered in granulated sugar. Some families called it a sugar sandwich when they folded it in half. Others called it a piece. In the rural South and through the Appalachian hollows, mothers handed this to children and said, "Go play." The butter held the sugar in place. The bread was soft enough to eat without teeth. A widow in Harlan County, Kentucky, ate this every afternoon for years because it was the only sweet thing she could afford. She kept a small jar of sugar next to the bread box and a stick of margarine on the counter. 3 ingredients. No preparation beyond spreading and sprinkling. Less than 5 cents per serving even in the 1980s. Nutritionists would call it empty fuel. The woman who ate it every afternoon called it the only good thing in her day. Number 22, tomato sandwich. 2 slices of white bread, a thick slice of garden tomato, a smear of mayonnaise, salt, and pepper. That was the summer snack that defined the American South for 100 years. You did not cook anything. You did not heat anything. You assembled it in under a minute and ate it standing over the kitchen sink while the juice ran down your wrist. For a senior with a tomato plant on the back porch, this was free food from June through September. Even without a garden, a single tomato from the farmer's market cost $0.25 in the 1970s. The bread was already in the house. The mayonnaise was already in the refrigerator. The whole thing came together faster than you could describe it. In small towns across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, church ladies brought tomato sandwiches to widows and widowers during the summer months. They wrapped them in wax paper and left them on the porch because they knew the person inside might not answer the door. That was not charity. that was knowing. Number 21. Peanut butter crackers. This was the snack that lived in every kitchen drawer, every glove compartment, every bedside table in America for decades. 2 saltine crackers with peanut butter spread between them. A jar of peanut butter cost 59 cents in 1971. A box of crackers cost less than a quarter. Together, they provided protein, fat, and enough substance to hold a person through the gap between lunch and dinner. Doris Novak, the widow in Scranton with the cracker tin, made these every afternoon at 3 o'clock. She kept the peanut butter in the cabinet directly above the tin so she never had to reach or bend or search. Everything was within arm's length. That mattered when your knees hurt and your balance was not what it used to be. She made 4 crackers, 2 sandwiches, and ate them with a glass of water at the kitchen table. Her daughter found the routine unchanged 9 years later. Same tin, same jar, same chair. The simplest snack in America, and it kept a woman anchored to her kitchen when the rest of her life had come undone. Number 20. Cottage cheese and canned peaches. In the 1950s and 1960s, this was considered a proper lunch. A scoop of cottage cheese on a plate, half a can of peach slices arranged around it, sometimes on a leaf of iceberg lettuce. Women's magazines called it a salad. Diners put it on the menu as a light plate. But for seniors living alone in the decades that followed, it became something different. It became the meal you made when you could not face the stove. Open a can, scoop from a container, sit down, eat. A can of store-brand peaches cost 49 cents in 1980. Cottage cheese was 89 cents for a pint. Together, they lasted 2 or 3 servings. No cooking, no cleanup beyond a spoon and a plate. The sweetness of the peaches against the mild tang of the cottage cheese was a combination that tasted like a cafeteria in 1958. For a senior who remembered exactly that, the flavor was not just food, it was a time machine. Number 19. Sardines on toast. A can of sardines opened and laid on a slice of buttered toast. That was the whole recipe. In the 1940s and 1950s, sardines were the cheapest source of protein on the grocery shelf. A can cost 10 cents. The fish were already cooked, already seasoned, already preserved. You did not need a refrigerator, a stove, or a single cooking skill. You needed a can opener and a piece of bread. For a senior living alone, sardines on toast solved every problem at once. No standing, no waiting, no dishes beyond 1 plate and 1 fork. The calcium in the soft bones was something most doctors now recommend specifically for aging adults, but the generation that ate sardines never knew the science. They just knew the price. A retired factory worker in Trenton, New Jersey, ate sardines on toast for lunch every day for 7 years. His wife had done the cooking before she died. He had never learned. Sardines were the only thing he could make without her. This was not just a snack for people who were frugal. This was a snack for people who were alone in a way that made cooking feel like a performance with no audience. The silence of a kitchen that used to have someone else in it changes the way food tastes. A can of sardines did not fix that silence, but it did not require you to pretend the silence was not there. You opened it, you ate it, you moved on. For millions of seniors in the decades after the war, that honesty was worth more than flavor. The tin can did not judge you for eating the same thing again. It did not ask why you stopped setting the table. It just fed you. And some days, that was enough to keep going. Number 18. Mayonnaise sandwich. 2 slices of white bread with a thick layer of mayonnaise. Nothing else. If you grew up with money, this sounds like a joke. If you grew up without it, this sounds like Tuesday. During the Depression, mayonnaise sandwiches were the lunch that children carried to school when there was nothing else in the house. The bread provided bulk. The mayonnaise provided fat and flavor. The whole thing cost almost nothing and could be assembled in the time it took to open the jar. By the 1970s and 1980s, seniors who had grown up eating these never stopped. A retired seamstress in Baltimore ate a mayonnaise sandwich for lunch almost every day. She added a thin slice of onion when she had one. She said the onion made it fancy. A jar of store-brand mayonnaise cost 79 cents and lasted weeks. 2 slices of bread cost a few pennies. This was a snack that poverty invented and habit preserved. Number 17. Cornbread in buttermilk. You crumbled leftover cornbread into a tall glass, poured cold buttermilk over it, and ate it with a spoon. In the South, this was not strange. This was supper. Farmers ate it after a day in the field. Grandmothers ate it before bed. Seniors living alone ate it whenever the kitchen felt too hot to turn on the stove. The cornbread was already made. The buttermilk was already cold. The whole thing came together in less than a minute, and the tartness of the buttermilk against the crumbly sweetness of the cornbread was a flavor that tasted like every back porch in the rural South from the 1930s through the 1970s. A box of cornmeal cost 39 cents in 1975. Buttermilk was 45 cents a quart. A single batch of cornbread made in a cast iron skillet could feed a person for 3 or 4 days, and the buttermilk kept it from going dry. Your grandfather did not need a recipe for this. He needed a glass. Number 16. Deviled egg spread on crackers. Hard-boil 2 eggs. Mash them in a bowl with a fork. Add a spoonful of mayonnaise, a dash of mustard, salt, and pepper. Spread it on crackers. 5 minutes, start to finish. This was the church potluck dish shrunk down to a portion of 1. Women who used to make deviled eggs for a crowd of 40 still made the filling after everyone was gone, but instead of piping it into halved whites, they spread it on whatever crackers were in the cupboard and ate it alone at the counter. A dozen eggs cost 80 cents in 1978. 2 eggs, a dab of mayo, and a handful of crackers made a snack that cost less than 15 cents and provided more protein than most things in the pantry. The ritual of mashing and mixing was familiar. The flavor was familiar. The only thing that had changed was the size of the audience. Number 15. Milk toast. A slice of bread toasted lightly, placed in a shallow bowl and covered with warm milk. Some people added a pat of butter. Some added sugar or cinnamon. Most just let the toast soften in the milk until it became something between bread and porridge. This was the food that mothers made for sick children and grandmothers made for themselves when their appetite vanished. In the 1920s and 1930s, milk toast was standard fare in hospitals and nursing homes across the country. It was gentle on the stomach, easy to swallow, and required no chewing. For a senior with dental problems, missing teeth, or a mouth too sore to handle anything solid, milk toast was not a snack. It was a lifeline, a way to take in nourishment without pain. The warm milk soothed, the bread dissolved, and the whole thing could be prepared in the time it took to boil water for tea. Doctors stopped recommending it, cookbooks stopped printing it, but the people who needed it never stopped making it. Number 14. Cheese Dreams. A slice of white bread topped with a slice of American cheese and placed under the broiler until the cheese melted and the edges browned. That was the entire recipe. In the 1940s and 1950s, these appeared in women's magazines as party appetizers, cut into triangles and served on platters. But by the time a senior was eating alone in a quiet kitchen in the 1970s, cheese dreams were not a party, they were dinner. A package of American cheese cost 69 cents in 1975. A loaf of bread cost 36 cents. The combination lasted a week or more. The broiler did all the work. 3 minutes, and the cheese was bubbling, golden, and stretching away from the bread in long strings that burned your mouth if you ate it too fast. That burn was the best part. It meant the food was hot, which meant the kitchen was working, which meant you were still managing. A hot meal, even a small one, felt like proof of something. A cold sandwich did not carry the same weight. Number 13. Applesauce on toast. A slice of toast spread with a thick layer of applesauce from a jar. That was it. In the Midwest and through the Pennsylvania Dutch country, applesauce was not a side dish. It was a staple. Families made it from windfall apples in the fall and canned enough jars to last until spring. A store-bought jar cost 45 cents in 1978. It kept for months unopened and days in the refrigerator after that. For a senior with swallowing difficulties, this was one of the safest foods in the pantry. Smooth, soft, slightly sweet, and impossible to choke on. The toast added just enough texture to make it feel like eating rather than drinking. Spread it, sit down, eat it. No standing required beyond the 90 seconds it took to toast the bread. Here is something that food companies never talk about. The snacks on this list were designed by necessity, not by chefs. Nobody tested them in a focus group. Nobody photographed them for a cookbook. They existed because a person with $12 in the checking account and a body that ached from the knees up needed to eat something before bed. The food industry spends billions every year selling snacks that cost $3 or $4 per serving. Protein bars, cheese platters, artisanal crackers. These cost pennies. The difference is not quality. The difference is that nobody makes money when a senior spreads applesauce on a piece of toast. There is no brand ambassador for bread and butter with sugar. There is no advertising campaign for crackers and milk. The cheapest snacks in America are invisible because they are unprofitable, and the people who eat them are invisible for the same reason. Number 12, buttered saltines with sugar. Take a cracker, spread butter on it, sprinkle sugar on top. That was a cookie in a household that could not afford cookies. Children ate them after school. Grandmothers ate them after dinner. Seniors living alone ate them whenever the craving for something sweet appeared, and the energy to bake did not. A sleeve of saltines, a stick of butter, and a cup of sugar produced dozens of these tiny treats. The butter made the sugar stick. The salt in the cracker made the sugar taste sweeter. The whole thing dissolved on the tongue in 3 bites. No plate needed, no fork, no cleanup. You could eat it standing at the counter or sitting in the living room without leaving a single crumb on the carpet. For a person who had stopped caring about meals but still wanted something sweet, this was the smallest possible indulgence, and it cost almost nothing. Number 11, banana and peanut butter bread. A slice of bread spread with peanut butter and topped with banana slices. Open face, no toasting required. The peanut butter held the banana in place. The bread held everything together. You could eat it with your hands, standing at the counter, in under 2 minutes. A bunch of bananas cost 25 cents a pound in 1980. Peanut butter was already in the cupboard. Bread was already in the bread box. This was the snack that required no shopping trip and no forethought. You looked at what was there, and you made it work. In the 1970s, school lunch programs across the country served a version of this as a sandwich. But for a senior living alone, the open-face version was better because it used half the bread and looked like more food on the plate. The banana added potassium, which helped with the leg cramps that kept so many older adults awake at night. Your grandmother did not know the word potassium. She just knew her legs stopped hurting when she ate a banana. Number 10, canned salmon spread on crackers. Open a can of salmon, mash it with a fork. Add a squeeze of lemon if you had one, a spoonful of mayonnaise if you did not. Spread it on crackers and eat. 5 minutes from pantry to plate. A can of pink salmon cost $1.39 in 1982. It made enough spread to cover a dozen crackers, which was 2 or 3 snacks depending on hunger. The soft bones in canned salmon dissolved when you mashed them, and they provided calcium that most seniors were not getting from any other source. Doctors now tell aging adults to eat canned salmon for bone density. The generation that ate it on crackers in the 1960s and 1970s did not need a doctor to tell them. They ate it because it was cheap, because it kept without refrigeration, and because it tasted like the tuna salad they used to make for picnics, except richer and slightly more pink. A widow in Omaha kept 4 cans in her pantry at all times. She said she would rather run out of coffee than run out of salmon. Number 9, toast with bacon grease and salt. After breakfast, the bacon grease went into a jar next to the stove. That jar was the seasoning rack for the entire kitchen. When a senior wanted a snack, a slice of bread went into the toaster, and a spoonful of warm bacon grease was spread across the top. A pinch of salt. That was the whole thing. The grease tasted like bacon without the bacon. It was rich, smoky, and satisfying in a way that plain butter could not match. In Appalachian households from the 1930s through the 1980s, the bacon grease jar was treated like a household treasure. You did not throw it away. You did not waste it. Every drop was used because every drop carried flavor that cost nothing extra. For a senior with no teeth, this was one of the easiest snacks to eat. The grease softened the bread, the salt gave it bite. The whole thing dissolved without effort. A retired coal miner's wife in Logan, West Virginia, said she had been eating toast with drippings since before she could read. She was 83 when she told that story. The bread had changed brands a dozen times. The jar had not changed once. Number 8. Rice in milk with sugar. Leftover rice from dinner, cold milk poured over it, a spoonful of sugar stirred in. That was a snack. In some households, it was breakfast. In others, it was the last thing eaten before bed. The rice had already been cooked, so there was nothing to prepare except assembling 3 ingredients in a bowl. The milk turned slightly starchy as it sat, thickening just enough to feel like a thin pudding. The sugar made it sweet. For a senior living alone, this was a way to use the leftover rice that always seemed to be sitting in the pot. Throwing food away felt wrong to a generation that remembered when there was none. Cold rice in milk was not a recipe anyone wrote down. It was a habit passed from hand to hand across kitchen tables in the Midwest and the South for decades. Your grandmother's grandmother ate this, your grandmother ate this, and if you were lucky enough to watch, you ate it too. Number 7. Crackers and potted meat. A small can of potted meat spread on saltine crackers. The can cost 29 cents in 1978. It contained enough paste to cover 8 or 10 crackers, which was a full snack for most people. The meat was already cooked, already seasoned, already shelf-stable. You peeled back the lid, spread it with a butter knife, and ate. No refrigeration needed until the can was opened. No cooking at any point. Potted meat was the food of truck drivers, hunters, and seniors who had stopped pretending that food needed to look good to be good enough. The flavor was salty, faintly smoky, and dense with protein. It tasted like the inside of a sandwich without the effort of making one. Church food pantries stocked it by the case because they knew exactly who would pick it up. Seniors on fixed incomes, people living in rooms without kitchens, anyone who needed sustenance and could not afford to be particular about where they came from. A can of potted meat and a sleeve of crackers was a full meal disguised as a snack, and it waited in the cupboard for months without complaint. Number 6. Open-faced cheese toast. A slice of bread, a slice of cheese, under the broiler for 3 minutes. The cheese melts, the bread toasts, and you eat it with your hands while it is still warm enough to string. This is cheese dreams without the fancy name. This is the snack that every American over the age of 70 made at least once a week without thinking about it. The difference between this and a grilled cheese sandwich was effort. A grilled cheese required a skillet, butter, flipping, and attention. Open-faced cheese toast required placing something flat on something flat and turning on the broiler. For a senior with unsteady hands, the elimination of the flip was not a preference. It was a safety measure. Hot skillets and shaking hands did not mix well. The broiler did all the work. You bent down once to put it in. You bent down once to take it out. That was all. Simple enough to make tired. Simple enough to make hurting. Simple enough to make alone. Number 5. Egg in a cup. Soft boil an egg for 3 minutes. Crack it into a cup. Mash it with a fork. Add butter, salt, and pepper. Eat it with a spoon or spread it on toast. This was the snack that hospital nurses in the 1940s and 1950s served to patients who could not handle solid food. It was gentle, warm, and packed with protein. For a senior at home, it required boiling water and 3 minutes of patience. Nothing else. The egg cost 6 or 7 cents in 1978. The butter was already on the counter. The whole thing fit in a teacup and could be eaten in bed, in a chair, or at the kitchen table. A retired librarian in Dayton, Ohio, ate an egg in a cup every morning for 14 years. She said it was the only thing she could stomach before noon. Her doctor said her protein levels were fine. She said her mother used to make it the same way, in the same kind of cup at the same time of day. The cup had changed. The recipe had not. Number 4. Graham crackers and milk. Break 2 graham crackers into a bowl. Pour cold milk over them. Eat before they get too soft. That was the bedtime snack of an entire generation. Graham crackers were invented in the 1820s as a health food. but by the 1950s and 1960s, they had become the cheapest sweet treat in the grocery store. A box cost 39 cents and lasted 2 weeks. The milk was already in the refrigerator. The whole thing came together in 30 seconds and tasted like childhood even when you were 80 years old. For seniors who had trouble sleeping, this became a nightly ritual. The warm weight of milk in the stomach, the gentle sweetness of the crackers, the quiet act of sitting at the table in a dark kitchen. It was not much. It was not meant to be much. It was meant to be the last thing you tasted before you turned off the light, and it worked. Number 3, bread and tomato soup dip. Open a can of condensed tomato soup. Heat it on the stove with a can of water or milk. Tear a piece of bread into chunks and dip it in the soup. That was lunch. That was dinner. That was whatever you needed it to be on a day when standing at the stove for more than 5 minutes was out of the question. A can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup cost 15 cents in 1970. It cost 39 cents in 1985. The bread was already in the house. The whole meal cost less than a quarter for most of the second half of the 20th century. Andy Warhol painted the can. Museum visitors paid $40 to see it. The senior eating the soup paid 39 cents and did not care about art. She cared that it was warm, that it was easy, and that the bread soaking in the tomato broth tasted like her mother's kitchen in 1942. That taste was worth more than any painting. Number 2, pimento cheese on crackers. Shredded cheddar cheese mixed with diced pimentos from a jar and enough mayonnaise to hold it together, spread on crackers. That was the appetizer at every church social, every funeral reception, every covered dish supper in the American South for 100 years. But it was also the snack that widows and widowers made alone in their kitchens on Saturday afternoons when the quiet became too heavy to ignore. A block of cheddar cost 99 cents in 1978. A jar of pimentos cost 35 cents. The mayonnaise was already in the refrigerator. You grated the cheese by hand, which took 2 or 3 minutes. You mixed it in a bowl, which took 1. You spread it on crackers, which took another. The whole process was 5 minutes of occupation, 5 minutes of using your hands for something that produced something, 5 minutes of not sitting still. For a senior living alone, the making was as important as the eating. It was proof that you could still produce food, that you had not given up on feeding yourself, that the kitchen was still yours. Number 1, bread and drippings. After any meal that produced fat, the drippings went into a jar or a bowl. Roast beef drippings, chicken drippings, bacon grease if nothing else was available. A slice of bread spread with those drippings and seasoned with salt was the snack that fed more poor people across more decades than anything else on this list. In the 1930s and 1940s, bread and drippings was an everyday occurrence in households that could not afford butter. The drippings carried the flavor of whatever meat had produced them, which meant every serving tasted slightly different. Beef drippings were rich and savory. Chicken drippings were lighter and golden. Pork drippings were smoky and dense. For a senior living alone, the jar of drippings next to the stove was a flavoring agent, a fat source, and a connection to every meal that had come before it. Every time you spread those drippings on bread, you were tasting the memory of a meal you had already eaten, and that memory made the bread taste like more than bread. These were not snacks anyone bragged about. These were snacks that kept people alive when the grocery money ran thin and the body ran tired and the kitchen felt too big for one person. They were invented by necessity and preserved by habit and forgotten by everyone except the people who needed them. Number 21. Cornbread crumbled in buttermilk. In the hills of eastern Kentucky and the river bottoms of western North Carolina, this was called crumble in or just something to tide you over. A wedge of leftover cornbread, cold or still warm from the cast iron skillet, crumbled into a tall drinking glass with cold buttermilk poured over the top. You ate it with a spoon. The buttermilk was sour and thin and turned the cornbread into something almost pudding-like after 2 minutes. Some families used whole milk instead, which they called sweet milk in those mountains. In 30 years of collecting oral histories from Appalachian families, food writer Ronnie Lundy found that not one person with mountain roots failed to mention this tradition. It was that universal. A box of cornmeal cost a dime in 1963. Buttermilk was free if a family kept a cow, and most farm families did. This was the evening snack for generations across those mountains, and the people who grew up eating it will tell you it remains one of the best things they have ever tasted. Cold leftover biscuits had their own logic in a southern kitchen. Breakfast biscuits were for the morning, but day-old biscuits were denser and slightly dried at the crust, better suited to cold butter and preserved fruit that made them an afternoon snack. You split them with your thumbs, never a knife. Cold butter went into the crumb and softened in seconds. Then a heavy spoon of fig or strawberry preserves from a mason jar put up in August. Across the South and into Appalachia, biscuit making was the skill that separated a real cook from someone who could just follow directions. You learned by feel, by the look of the dough, by how it pulled from the bowl. The preserves came from fruit grown close by or given as a gift. Both skills, the biscuit and the put-up fruit, began leaving kitchens in the 1980s as convenience baking and store-bought jam made the from-scratch versions feel unnecessary. They were not unnecessary. 3:30 in the afternoon, the screen door banging shut, and there they were. Celery sticks already filled and lined up on a plate. Ants on a log needed no oven, no stove, and no supervision beyond a mother with 10 minutes and a jar of peanut butter. You spread it thick into the groove of each celery stalk, then pressed raisins in one by one until they looked like insects marching in a line. It showed up in home economics classes by the 1960s and became an after-school staple through the next decade. Some mothers used cream cheese instead. A few let their kids assemble their own, which guaranteed twice as many raisins ended up in mouths as on the celery. The crunch, the salt, the sweetness. It was the kind of snack that made you feel like somebody had thought about you before you walked through the door. Number 15. Dandelion greens with vinegar and bacon grease. In April and May, the front yards of rural families across Appalachia became a free food source. The young dandelion greens, picked before they flowered, the older ones turned too bitter, got washed and dressed in a skillet with hot bacon grease and a splash of apple cider vinegar, sometimes with a little sugar to balance the acid. In 1937, the USDA published a bulletin recommending dandelion greens for low-income households, calling them among the most nutrient-rich wild plants available. Your grandmothers had understood this for generations before any government publication said so. A woman in Mingo County, West Virginia, described going out to pick greens with her mother in the 1940s and continuing the tradition into the 1960s. Not because times were hard, but because that was what spring tasted like. Free and in season and better than most things your family could have bought. Wonder Bread pinwheels required a rolling pin, a refrigerator, and patience, which is why they felt like an achievement when you got them right. You pressed the rolling pin across a fresh slice until it was almost paper thin, spread it to the edges with cream cheese or thin sliced ham, rolled it tight from one end, and refrigerated it for 20 minutes. Then out, sliced on a diagonal, each round holding its shape. Wonder Bread, introduced by the Taggart Baking Company of Indianapolis in 1921, was specifically engineered soft enough to compress without tearing. The softness critics mocked was the entire structural point. Whole wheat wouldn't roll. Sourdough shattered. The pinwheel was one of the few things a child in the 1980s could make from scratch that looked like party food. The technique required actual skill, feel for the right pressure, the right amount of filling, and once kitchens moved on, no one thought to teach it again. A moon pie and an RC Cola carried a price and a history. The marshmallow-filled graham cracker sandwich coated in chocolate or banana, paired with Royal Crown, cost under a dime apiece at the company store. The moon pie was created in 1917 at the Chattanooga Bakery in Tennessee when a traveling salesman visited a coal camp and asked what miners wanted. Something big, filling, cheap enough to eat on a break. They held their hands in a circle and described it the size of the moon. By the 1970s, every mountain child knew the ritual. One bite of moon pie, then a long pull of cold RC. The carbonation cut through the marshmallow in a way no other drink could match. Pepsi was wrong. Coke was wrong. RC was the one. Old men at the filling station did this the same way on a Tuesday in 1972 they had in 1952. When the company store closed and the stool went with it, the man who always sat there went too. The moon pie is still on the rack. The rest of it is gone. She started shaping it the night before, always the night before. The cheese ball was the centerpiece of every 1970s party table, and making one meant softening 2 blocks of cream cheese, folding in sharp cheddar, Worcestershire sauce, garlic powder, and sometimes diced onion. You mixed it by hand, formed it into a round the size of a softball, wrapped it tight, and chilled it overnight so the flavors settled. The next day, you rolled it in crushed pecans until every surface was covered and set it on a plate surrounded by Ritz crackers. Cheese balls in America trace back to 1801, when citizens of Cheshire, Massachusetts, presented a 1,200-pound wheel to President Jefferson. The 70s version was modest, but at every holiday gathering, every cookout, there it sat. The woman who brought the best one knew it, and everyone else did too. Nobody fought over recipes louder than they fought over whose cheese ball belonged at the center of the table. Number 23. Peanuts in a Coke bottle. Take a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. Drink a few sips from the neck to make room. Tear open a sleeve of salted peanuts and pour them straight in. Then tilt the bottle at 40 degrees and drink. That is a farmer's Coke. And the tradition goes back to at least the 1920s when packaged peanuts first started appearing beside the soda cooler at Southern general stores. Workers in the fields of Georgia and Alabama poured their peanuts in because they had dirty hands and no time to stop and eat separately. A snack and a drink became one thing: sweet, salty, fizzy, crunchy. The peanuts stayed crisp in the Coke, and each sip brought 1 or 2 along. By the 1960s, this tradition had moved from the fields to the front porch to the baseball game. If you grew up in the South, you learned it by watching a parent. Not one advertisement was ever made for it. Some things are passed down because your family passed them to you, and that is enough. Before instant pudding packets made it a 5-minute job, stovetop vanilla pudding was something you watched someone make from scratch. Milk, sugar, cornstarch, a wooden spoon that never stopped circling the bottom of the pot. You stood at the stove because you were allowed to lick the spoon when it was almost done, and because watching the pudding thicken, going from thin and liquid to thick and glossy, was a kind of slow kitchen magic. By the 1980s, Jell-O instant mixes had taken over most households, but in some kitchens the pudding still came off the stove warm. You ate it straight from the pot before it reached a bowl. Hot vanilla pudding has a depth that the cold, set version loses entirely. The woman who made it that way understood that. She is gone now, and the pot sits unused in a cabinet somewhere. The cold biscuit with cane syrup needed no recipe, just a leftover cat head biscuit from morning, gone cool on the back of the stove, split with a thumb, filled with a slow pour of sorghum from a tin with a hinged lid. The biscuit soaked it from the inside out. You held it over the sink because it ran. Some families pressed butter in first, so it sealed. Sorghum came from the community press, boiled down in iron kettles every fall. Mountain families relied on it as their primary sweetener because sugarcane never grew at that elevation. By the time the 1970s came around, you could still find Dixie Dew syrup in some cabinets, the label claiming it gave a biscuit a college education, and old-timers found it funny and a little sad that you now had to buy what always came from a neighbor's press. The after-school ritual that needed no permission and no dish went quiet after that. That same butter from the cheese ball found its way into a saucepan the next morning, melted with brown sugar, corn syrup, and a pinch of salt until it bubbled into something golden. Homemade caramel corn started with plain popped kernels and a batch of stovetop caramel poured hot over the popcorn in a roasting pan. You stirred it with a wooden spoon, then slid it into a low oven, 250, for a full hour, pulling it out every 15 minutes to turn it. The baking soda was the secret. Half a teaspoon whisked into the caramel right before pouring made the coating puff up light and crisp instead of turning hard as glass. Families folded in roasted peanuts at the end. their own version of Cracker Jack, years before it came in foil bags at the convenience store. A pan cost less than $1 in 1973 and fed a living room full of kids without a single complaint. Number 16. Raw potato slices with salt. A potato pulled from the root cellar, rinsed, sliced thin with a paring knife, laid out on a plate, and salted. If you grew up in farm communities across the Plain States, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, raw potato slices were the simple, free snack that appeared when everything else was put away and supper was still 2 hours out. Children ate them standing at the kitchen counter. The potato tasted starchy and faintly sweet when truly fresh. The salt brought out something that tasted almost buttery. No cooking, no heating, no waiting. A 10-year-old could make this in under 3 minutes. Potatoes kept in the root cellar from October through February, the most reliable thing in a house where other items ran out. A 10-pound bag of potatoes cost 49 cents in 1963. That is a month's worth of afternoon snacks for almost nothing. Nobody wrote this down as a recipe, and if your grandmother made it, she didn't need to. Chocolate milk made with Hershey's syrup was never just chocolate milk. It was a ratio, and everyone who grew up making it had their own and was willing to argue about it. You tilted the squeeze bottle, counted to a number, and stirred until the dark pool at the bottom lifted. Stop too soon, and you'd drink thin milk, then hit pure sweetness at the end. Hershey's syrup had been sold in tin cans since 1926, but in 1979 the company switched to the plastic squeeze bottle, the only version every 80s kid knew. The school cafeteria's chocolate milk was too uniform. The kind you made at home had variation, and you learned to correct for it pour by pour. Most kitchens don't keep a squeeze bottle anymore. The muscle memory for the count has gone quiet. Peanut butter and Caro syrup fudge was made in a bowl without a stove, a thermometer, or much patience. Spoon peanut butter into a bowl, pour Caro corn syrup over it, stir until it stiffened into a dense, sticky mass that held its shape when you pinched off a piece. That was the candy. Hard in the refrigerator, soft in a warm kitchen, eaten off the fingers or rolled into balls and dusted with powdered sugar. Mountain women called it poor man's fudge, which was accurate. Real chocolate fudge required a candy thermometer and cream, neither guaranteed. Caro and peanut butter were always in the cabinet. Corn syrup had been a staple in Appalachian kitchens since the early 20th century when cane sugar was too expensive and peanuts from the Piedmont lowlands made peanut butter an affordable staple. 2 cheap ingredients, 1 snack better than anything fancy. The women who made it never measured. You could not get it right if you measured. The first kernel hit the oil and you counted. 1, 2, 3. Then the rest followed like a drum roll under a heavy lid. Stovetop popcorn was the sound of a Friday night, made in a deep pot with a few tablespoons of vegetable oil and a 1/4 cup of yellow kernels shaken hard over a gas flame until the popping slowed to silence. You learned the timing by ear. Too soon, and half the kernels sat unpopped. Too late, and the whole batch scorched. The finish came after. A full stick of melted butter poured slow while you shook the bowl, then enough salt to make your fingers white. Before Orville Redenbacher introduced his gourmet kernels in 1970, this was the only way popcorn happened in most homes. The heavy pot, the oil, the shaking, 5 minutes, almost nothing spent. Kids today will never know what it sounded like to stand in that kitchen, waiting for the last pop. Number 24. Bread, butter, and sugar. White bread, a thin layer of butter, a sprinkle of white sugar pressed between the 2 halves. That was the whole recipe. If you grew up across rural Ohio, Indiana, and Missouri, grew up believing this was a real treat. The butter kept the sugar anchored. The bread went soft in the hand if held too long, and it had to be eaten fast or the sugar started shifting loose. In 1960, a loaf of white bread cost 20 cents. A 5-pound bag of sugar cost 38 cents. For a family of 5 with no snack money, that sugar sandwich cost less than a penny per child. Mothers didn't call it poverty food. Your mother called it a snack, and that was that. Decades later, grandmothers still make these for grandchildren without thinking much about where the tradition came from. Some things stay because they are simple and they work. Cream cheese on date nut bread was a snack that belonged to grandmother's kitchens in church bazaars, the kind of place where the bread came wrapped in wax paper and sat on the counter all week. Date nut bread, dense and dark with the sweetness of medjool dates and the crunch of pressed walnuts, was sold in small cylindrical loaves through the 1960s and 70s. You spread Philadelphia cream cheese on those rounds the way you'd spread it on a bagel, only thicker. Philadelphia cream cheese had been produced since 1872, originally made in Chester, New York by dairyman William Lawrence, and by the 1980s it was the default American spread for anything needing richness without effort. The cream cheese against the sweet, heavy date crumb created something far more considered than it was. By the 1980s, date nut bread had started its long disappearance from bakery shelves, pushed out by muffins and convenience loaves. The grandmother who kept it stopped buying it when it became hard to find, and then she was gone too. Honeysuckle grew along every fence line and ditch bank in Appalachia, and any mountain child knew the exact method. Pinch the green base between two fingers, pull the stamen through slowly from the bottom until the tiny, clear bead of nectar appeared at the tip. Touch it to your tongue. 1 drop. Pure concentrated sweetness, unlike anything sold. You worked the vine for 10 minutes for a tablespoon total, and it was worth every minute. Japanese honeysuckle spread through the South and Appalachian mountains so thoroughly it was classified as invasive. But to mountain children, it was just the free snack on every fence all summer, requiring only patience and the knowledge of how to pull the stamen without losing the drop. Nobody taught it formally. You watched an older child once, and the motion transferred completely. Your grandmother could strip a vine faster than any child, her fingers recalling 60 years of practice. The vine still grows on those same fence lines. Nobody works it for nectar anymore. Before there were bags of it on every shelf, Chex Party Mix was something you made at home, and every household had a version that was fiercely different from everyone else's. The base was always the same: rice and wheat Chex tossed with pretzel sticks and mixed nuts in a roasting pan. Then came the coating: melted butter, Worcestershire sauce, garlic salt, and onion powder stirred until the kitchen smelled sharp and warm. You baked it at 250 degrees, stirring every 15 minutes for almost an hour. The recipe ran on the back of the Chex box starting in the late 1950s, but by the 70s, every mother had her own adjustments: a splash of Tabasco, a handful of sesame sticks, a dusting of seasoned salt that made hers the one people asked for at church potlucks. You knew whose batch you were eating without being told. Nobody makes it from scratch anymore. The bags are easier, but they don't smell like her kitchen did. Number 17, cinnamon toast in the oven. White bread, buttered, dusted with cinnamon and sugar, slipped under the broiler or set flat in a low oven until the edges turned brown and the sugar formed a thin, crackling crust. The smell that came out of that oven reached every room in the house and brought you running without being called. In the farmhouses of southern Missouri and the small towns of western Tennessee, this was the Saturday afternoon snack, the one that meant there were a few spare minutes and enough sugar left in the canister. A loaf of bread cost 20 cents in 1965. The cinnamon lasted months. The whole thing was done in under 10 minutes and required nothing that wasn't already in the house. What you remember from those days isn't the recipe. They remember the smell, the sound of that sugar crust breaking when they bit into it, the warmth in their hands on a cold afternoon. The crust and the smell. That was childhood. Ants on a log sounds like something a camp counselor invented on a dare, but from the 1950s onward, it was the snack that taught American kids that cooking could mean assembly, not heat. You split a celery stalk, dragged a butter knife heavy with peanut butter through the groove until full, and lined the raisins up one by one, never dumping them, always placing, because the spacing was the whole point. The Oxford Companion to American Food and Drink traces the name to a Minneapolis Star-Tribune article from February of 1959, where a family described it as something children had started making themselves. The Girl Scouts had a version in their cookbooks as far back as 1946, though they just called it celery sticks. What the name added was theater. By the 1980s, it had moved from summer camp to every kitchen in America, every kid making it the same way. Deliberate raisin placement, as if rules existed. They did. Nobody wrote them down. Cracklins in a paper bag were not pork rinds, and any mountain child would tell you so without blinking. Real cracklins came from hog butchering day, the skin and fat layer cut into squares, dropped into a boiling lard kettle, and cooked until they puffed and turned golden, the outer shell shattering when you bit through to a chewy, fatty center that tasted like concentrated smokehouse and fire. Shaken in a paper bag with salt while still hot, eaten by the handful while the kettle was still going. There was no second batch, only what came off that hog that day in that yard. The Cherokee in Appalachia had long rendered animal fat as both food and medicine, and European settlers adopted the total-use butchering practice. Fat became lard, skin became cracklins, bones became broth. Store-bought pork rinds are puffed with air and dusted with powder. Cracklins were dense, dark, bitter at the edges where the fat caramelized against the iron. The women who knew how to render them slow are mostly gone. The kettle rusted. Nobody admitted it was just two ingredients. That was the unspoken agreement of every 1970s party. You brought the dip, someone complimented it, and you accepted the praise like you'd spent hours in the kitchen. Lipton onion soup dip was one envelope of dried soup mix stirred into a pint of sour cream, chilled, and set out with ridged potato chips. Kraft printed the recipe on the packet in 1958, calling it California Dip, and within a decade it was the most popular dip in America. By the 70s, it showed up at every barbecue, every card party, every Super Bowl gathering, always in the same ceramic bowl, always with ruffles strong enough to hold a loaded scoop. Some women added a spoonful of mayo, others folded in chives. The base never changed, and the compliments never stopped. The pre-made dip aisle killed it, but the jar version never tasted the way hers did, and everybody knew it. Number 22. Saltine crackers and milk. A handful of saltines broken into a bowl, warm milk poured over the top, a pinch of sugar if the mother was feeling generous. The crackers soaked up the milk and turned soft enough to eat with a spoon. If you grew up in mill-town households across New England and rural Pennsylvania, a variation on bread and milk for families who kept saltines in the house and sometimes ran short of bread. In the 1960s, a box of saltines cost about 23 cents. A quart of milk was 25 cents. That is an afternoon snack for a family of 4 for under 50 cents. Children in the textile towns of the Piedmont called it stewed crackers. Some families added a little butter while the milk was still warm. The crackers dissolved at the edges first, leaving a thick paste at the bottom of the bowl that tasted better than it had any right to. No stove required, no pots to wash. Those were the two best qualities a snack could have. Peanut butter and banana on Wonder Bread was the everyday version of something Elvis Presley had made famous by frying. But in the 1980s, most kids ate it cold and unadorned, pressed flat before being cut into rectangles, never triangles. You spread the peanut butter thick enough to hold the banana slices in place, laid them in a single layer, and ate it standing at the counter before the bread had time to go soggy. The banana had to be ripe, but not soft. A soft banana turned the bread wet in minutes, and you learned that by ruining one. Presley's documented preference was for his version fried in butter with bacon and honey, a recipe associated with his childhood in Tupelo, Mississippi. The cold version your mother made after school had none of that richness. What it had was speed, and it was ready before you'd finished dropping your backpack on the floor. Peanuts in an RC Cola was the one ritual every mountain kid performed without being taught. Tilt the bottle slightly, pour the salted peanuts past the neck, feel them hit the cola and fizz up in a sweet salt cloud, then drink. The peanuts sank, then floated. Then you got both at once, cold carbonation and soft beer nut richness that no store ever packaged together because nobody needed to. RC. Cola had deep roots in Appalachia. Royal Crown spread through the mining towns and hollows long before convenience stores arrived, the miner's cola, the working man's 79-cent choice. The peanuts were Lance or Tom's, picked up at the register. Nobody told you the ratio. You watched someone do it once, your father, your uncle, some older boy at the filling station, and you knew. Your grandmother did it the same way her mother did. When she stopped being there to do it, nobody reached for those peanuts the same way anymore. At every Thanksgiving spread, every Christmas Eve buffet, every funeral repast in the 70s, a relish tray held its place at the edge of the table, and stuffed celery was always on it. The filling was softened cream cheese beaten smooth, folded with chopped pimento stuffed green olives and a little of the olive brine for sharpness. You spooned it into the curve of each stalk, then lined them up between carrot sticks and radish roses, the crunch of the celery against the tang of the olives, cold, crisp, and gone before the turkey was carved. Making the relish tray was the job of whoever arrived first, and the women who did it took quiet pride in how neatly the celery was cut, how evenly the filling sat. It was never the star of the table, but its absence was always noticed. The relish tray itself has all but vanished now, and the stuffed celery went with it. Number 20. Lard and sugar bread. An open-faced slice of white bread spread with rendered lard and sprinkled with sugar. If you grew up in farm communities across Iowa, Illinois, and the hill country of Arkansas, this was the dessert that appeared when there was no dessert. The lard was always in the house because families kept their own hogs or bought it in 5-pound cans. Sugar cost about 8 cents a pound in 1965. Spread thin on lard-coated bread, a teaspoon of sugar went far and tasted richer than it had any right to. The lard kept the sugar from sliding off and melted slightly against the warmth of a hand. Historian Richard Willis recalled eating these on a Depression-era farm in Iowa, but the tradition carried well into the 1960s in households where the lard bucket never left the stovetop. Bread, fat, sugar. Your mother and grandmother both knew that was enough to get a child from 3 in the afternoon to supper time without complaint. Pizza toast on white bread was what every American kid made in the years before bagel bites, and it was better in every way that mattered. You spread contadina or Hunt's tomato paste, not pizza sauce, not marinara, but the concentrated paste from the small can, across a slice of white bread, covered it with shredded mozzarella, and slid it under the broiler. 4 minutes watching. The cheese went from white to spotted to pulling away at the corners, and when it browned at the edges while still soft in the center, it was ready. Bagel Bites launched in 1985, created by 2 brothers in Hallandale, Florida, and within a few years became the commercial standard for after-school pizza snacking. Before that, the pizza toast was what you made yourself, how much paste, how thick the cheese, whether to shake oregano from the jar above the stove. The homemade version didn't disappear because it was inferior. It disappeared because the commercial one required no watching. Cheese straws carried the kind of heat that crept up slow, cayenne hidden inside a buttery shell that shattered the second you bit down. The dough was sharp cheddar grated fine, cold butter worked in by hand, a cup of flour, and enough cayenne to give it bite without making anyone reach for water. You rolled it thin, sliced it into narrow strips with a pastry wheel, and baked at 350 until golden, something between a cracker and a shortbread, but entirely savory. The recipe dates to the 19th century in the American South, where cheese straws appeared at everything from afternoon teas to wedding receptions. They hit their stride in the 1970s when finger foods ruled every party. A good batch stored in a tin for a week and still snapped clean when you broke one. The women who made the best ones never shared the exact amount of cayenne. You asked, they smiled, and they changed the subject. Number 18. Peanut butter on saltines. A jar of peanut butter, a sleeve of saltines, a knife or the back of a spoon. In 1965, a jar of Skippy peanut butter cost 79 cents. A box of saltines cost 23 cents. Together, they provided a week's worth of after-school snacks for under $1, which made them the reliable default in households from rural Ohio to the farms of western Kansas. The cracker had to be firm enough to hold the peanut butter without snapping, and if 3 saltines were stacked, they could be carried in one hand without losing any. If you grew up eating these, you probably still make them today without ever thinking to call it anything but a snack. No plate needed, no preparation beyond opening 2 packages, a box of crackers on the table, and a jar of peanut butter beside it. That was your whole afternoon after school. Frozen orange juice popsicles made in ice cube trays with toothpicks came out of the post-war American kitchen, where the chest freezer was new and the idea of making your own frozen treats was still a genuine discovery. You poured diluted Minute Maid concentrate into each slot, 1 can concentrate, 3 cans water, pressed a flat toothpick into the center, and carried the tray level to the freezer. The trick was the toothpick standing straight before the juice started setting. Minute Maid had introduced frozen concentrated orange juice commercially in 1946, a technology developed during World War II to ship juice to troops overseas without spoilage, and by the 1980s it sat in nearly every American freezer. Otter Pops and Fudgsicles were the commercial replacement, cheaper, already frozen, but they tasted like approximations. The toothpick version tasted like what you'd poured into a glass that morning. The real thing, just colder. Number 14, molasses on biscuits. A biscuit split in half, a pour of sorghum molasses into the open face of the bread, folded and eaten over the sink because it dripped. In the southern mountains, sorghum was sometimes called the poor people's sweetener, and that was accurate. A family in Harlan County, Kentucky could produce their own sorghum from a small plot of cane, and a quart jar of thick, dark syrup was worth more than most store-bought sweets. The molasses soaked into the soft biscuit quickly and had to be eaten fast before it ran. If you grew up in those mountains, you ate these before school and again when you came home in the afternoon. The biscuit cost almost nothing if a family used their own flour and lard. The sorghum was often bartered, grown locally, or carried from the general store for about 15 cents a quart in 1963. That was your whole season of cold afternoons. Number 13, cracklin' bread bites. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week, just one. The cinnamon toast, the peanut butter crackers, the egg in a cup, then sit down at the table, not the couch. Use a plate, not a paper towel. Set a place the way your mother used to set a place, even when she was eating alone, even when nobody was watching. Eat it slow, because these snacks were never just about being cheap. They were about staying anchored to the act of feeding yourself when the world made it easy to stop trying. A cracker with peanut butter is not a meal, but spreading it, sitting down, eating it from a plate instead of over the sink, that is a decision. That is a person choosing to stay in the fight. Share which one you are going to make in the comments. Tell me if the bread and drippings gets more love than the pimento cheese. Tell me if anyone else's grandmother kept a cracker tin on the counter the way Doris Novak did in Scranton for 9 years without missing a week. Because these are not just snacks. They are proof that the smallest food made in the shortest time eaten alone can still be an act of dignity.